Last week, the president authorized a missile strike on the al-Shairat airfield in Syria, the same airfield that 2 days before had been used by Bashar al-Assad to launch a brutal chemical weapons attack on his own people. This week, we hear of news reports that Russia knew in advance of Syria's chemical weapons attack and did nothing to stop it. One senior American official now says a Russian-operated drone flew over a hospital in Syria as victims of the attack were rushing to get treatment. Hours after the drone left, a Russian-made fighter jet bombed the hospital in what American officials believe was an attempt to cover up the usage of chemical weapons. We loudly condemn the attacks as well as those who we believe failed to stop it. But while we seek to punish those who orchestrated these attacks, we do little to help the victims. The president, who was shown pictures of the heinous attack, said he was moved by the sight of beautiful babies, cruelly murdered in this very barbaric attack. The Syrians became real people through these images, no longer nameless, faceless others. There was a father still clinging to his 9-month-old twin girls, after rigor mortis had set in. A pile of children heaped one on top of another, foam still dotting their mouths in death, all victims of the suspected sarin gas attack in northwest Syria's Idlib province. No child of God, the president declared, should ever suffer such horror. Unfortunately, all too many Syrian children endure such horrors daily. Many of you may still, and perhaps may always, remember the 2015 picture of a 3-year-old Syrian boy washed up on a beach in Turkey. But do you remember his name? He and his refugee family were trying to reach safe haven in Europe amid the European refugee crisis, but he never made it. The world was outraged as we saw his lifeless body face down on the beach, and we heard how human smugglers stuffed 16 terrified people on a rubber inflatable boat made for 8 that capsized in the Mediterranean Sea. The boy's name was Alyan Kurdi. And then we, the world, moved on while the Syrian refugee crisis dragged on. Like the picture of Alyan, the images of the most recent Syrian victims once again bring home one of the hard realities of this crisis, its widespread impact on children fleeing death and destruction with their families. According to Save the Children, my former employer, some 600 or more children died last year alone attempting to cross the Mediterranean Sea to safety. In ordering the strike, our president placed the United States back in the throes of the thorny humanitarian political crisis that is the Syrian civil war. That crisis, now stretching past 6 years, seems to have no end in sight. As we now enter the crisis's 7th year, civilians continue to bear the brunt of one of the worst humanitarian crises of our time. Syria's pre-war population of 22 million people has been decimated. More than 11 million people have been killed or forced to flee their homes. Bombings continue to destroy crowded cities, and horrific human rights violations are widespread. Basic necessities like food and medical care are sparse. The United Nations estimates that 6.3 million people are internally displaced. And when you also consider the refugees, well over half of the country's pre-war population of 22 million is in need of urgent humanitarian assistance, whether they remain in the country or have escaped across borders. As for Syria's children, 2 in 3 have suffered a war-related loss of a loved one, had their houses bombed, or suffered injuries, according to Save the Children. 50% of Syrian children are no longer in school, and 1 in 4 are at risk of severe mental health disorders with potentially lifelong consequences. Last week, our president stated that the international community has failed to resolve the crisis in Syria. Specifically, he said, as a result, the refugee crisis continues to deepen and the region continues to destabilize, threatening the United States and its allies. The crisis persists, as does the question of what can be done to end it. But that is not the only question that must be answered. It seems beyond debate to me that the international community can no longer simply bear witness to the atrocities that have been committed against the people of Syria. So we must ask ourselves, what should our country do about the incessant violence that begets an equally unrelenting surge of refugees? What do we do about the Alyan Kurds hoping to make it to safety with their families? And what do we do about those families fleeing barrel bombs, sarin gas, or the missiles intended to cover up the use of that gas? Implicated in these questions are questions of how to address the issue of radical terrorists bent on bringing Paris-like mayhem to America's shores, either by infiltrating the United States refugee program, or perhaps exploiting some security weakness so as to terrorize our homeland. This administration's answer thus far is to deny sanctuary in the United States to the victims and ostensible terrorists alike. Treat them all the same, even if the images that moved our president to action last week clearly demonstrate that they are most definitely not all the same. I would not say that a single strike against a single target for using chemical and biological weapons represents a coherent policy statement, nor was it likely meant to be. But in the near term, it upholds our American ideal against the use of chemical weapons in armed conflict at any time. I'll leave it to others to divine and craft the longer-term foreign policy strategy. But as for Syria's people, its displaced, its refugees, perhaps this is a policy that portends the upholding of another American ideal. Our country's long tradition of embracing those forced to flee their homes because of socio-political circumstances well beyond their control. The introduction of immigration historian Oscar Handlin's 1952 Pulitzer Prize-winning work, The Uprooted, fixes the role of the immigrant experience in the American experience, stating, "Once I thought to write a history of the immigrants in America. Then I discovered that the immigrants were American history." Handlin, who is well known as the father of the immigration history field, reminds us that the experience of migration is key to America's story, and that most Americans are in fact descended from immigrants. I stand before you an American who is the son of Haitians descended from African slaves. So we are Americans, and yet we also define ourselves through our ancestral roots. The proverbial cultural melting pot comes to mind. The richness of our traditions, our culture, our food, our literature, all implicate some other identity. And that acknowledgement of our past diverse identities, somehow along the way, became another proud American tradition. We tout our unique melting pot tradition on the one hand, while we let our fear that someone different will perpetrate another 9/11 fuel talk of walls, travel bans, and registries for foreign-born residents. How do we reconcile the competing values that undergird these narratives? Make no mistake, the anti-immigrant, anti-other nativist narrative is one driven by fear of the other. In issuing a revised travel ban last month, the president seemingly attempted to navigate the constitutional pitfalls that plagued his original January 27th travel ban, which temporarily excluded citizens of 7 predominantly Muslim countries from traveling to the United States. And it temporarily halted the United States' refugee resettlement program and called for a stricter vetting of refugees. The revised travel ban also removes Iraq from the list of countries whose citizens are temporarily banned from traveling to the United States because the Pentagon was concerned that keeping Iraq on the list would hamper their coordination effort to defeat ISIS. The revised travel ban drops language favoring persecuted religious minorities and reversed an indefinite ban on refugees from Syria, replacing it with a 120-day ban that requires executive branch review and renewal instead. The new order also keeps in place one of the centerpieces of the old one, the administration's decision to cut the number of refugees admitted every year by more than half, from about 110,000 to 50,000. The revised ban, like the first one, was also immediately engulfed in litigation challenging its constitutionality, resulting in a federal court in Hawaii issuing a nationwide temporary restraining order. That order was since extended by that same federal judge into a preliminary injunction. Now, the proponents of the travel ban argue it is an attempt to make our country safer. Assuming most Americans are in favor of making our homeland as safe as possible, our challenge then is how do we as a country own up to our fear of radicals who seek to destroy our ideals and freedoms without allowing that fear to overwhelm those ideals and lead us to policy outcomes that betray our values? How do we resist the fear of the other from impelling us toward a headlong rush to paint the victims and would-be terrorists with a single stroke of an overly broad brush? One way is to learn from our past and do better. Days after the revised ban was issued, lawyers for the state of Hawaii, which filed suit challenging the first executive order, filed an amended complaint seeking a temporary restraining order blocking several sections of the new one. In the amended filing, Hawaii references the Supreme Court case of Korematsu versus United States. Hawaii goes on to say the new executive order is antithetical to Hawaii's state identity and spirit. For many in Hawaii, including state officials, the executive order conjures up the memory of the Chinese Exclusion Acts and the imposition of martial law and Japanese internment after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Korematsu, as many of you might recall, was that 1944 case in which the Supreme Court held that Japanese Americans could lawfully be interred during World War II because the danger of espionage met the compelling interest required by the government to take such an action. Of course, today, that ruling is universally reviled. But both the court's liberal and conservative wings have denounced Korematsu. And Korematsu should remind us of what happens to our values when we succumb to the fear of the other. After Pearl Harbor was bombed in December 1941, the American military feared a Japanese attack on the US mainland, and the American government worried that Americans of Japanese descent might aid the enemy. The stage was then set for the government to react out of fear of the other. In 1942, President Roosevelt signed an executive order forcing many West Coast Japanese and Japanese Americans into internment camps. The executive order, number 9066, led to the imprisonment of over 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent in what were essentially concentration camps here in the United States. Most prisoners were American citizens. All were imprisoned because they were racial descendants of Japanese, not because they were disloyal to the United States or convicted agents of the Japanese Empire. On March 27, 1942, General John DeWitt, commander of the Western Defense Area, prohibited Japanese Americans from leaving the limits of Military Area Number 1 in preparation for their evacuation to internment camps. Fred Korematsu, a Japanese American, underwent plastic surgery on his eyelids in an unsuccessful attempt to pass as a Caucasian, changed his name to Clyde Sarah, and claimed to be of Spanish and Hawaiian heritage. On May 3, 1942, General DeWitt ordered Japanese Americans to report on May 9th to assembly centers as a prelude to being removed to the internment camps. Korematsu refused. He went into hiding in the Oakland area, and on May 30th of 1942, he was arrested on a street corner in San Francisco and held at a jail there. His crime? He was in a place from which the government excluded all persons of Japanese ancestry. Korematsu went on to challenge his conviction in the courts, arguing that Congress, the president, and the military did not have the power to issue the relocation orders and that he was being discriminated against based on his race. The government responded by arguing that the evacuation was necessary to protect the country, and the Federal Appeals Court agreed. Korematsu went on to the Supreme Court, where the court ruled 6-3 that the executive order was justified by military necessity, that is, national security. The court agreed with the government, holding that the need to protect the country was a greater priority than the individual rights of the Japanese and Japanese Americans. The court adopted a new test, strict scrutiny, holding that any law or order that discriminated on the basis of race or ethnicity could only be constitutional if it served a compelling state interest. The court found in Korematsu that the government had met its burden because discrimination against the Japanese, in this case, addressed the government's military concerns about the possibility of Japanese spies. The dissent, led by Justice Frank Murphy, one of 3 dissenters, labeled the executive order for what it was, racially motivated. Justice Murphy, a graduate of this university's law school, stated that the government put forth no adequate reason for failing to treat Japanese Americans on an individual basis by holding investigations and hearings to separate the loyal from the disloyal, as was done in the case of persons of German and Italian ancestry. Justice Murphy acknowledged in his dissent that there were indeed some disloyal persons of Japanese descent on the Pacific coast who did all in their power to aid their ancestral land. He then pointed out that similar disloyal activities were engaged in by persons of German, Italian, and even more pioneer stock in our country. But he cautioned against extrapolating from examples of individual disloyalty to establish group disloyalty that then justifies discriminatory action against the entire group. To do so, he advised, is to deny that under our system of law, individual guilt is the sole basis of deprivation of rights. Moreover, this inference, which is at the very heart of the evacuation orders, has been used in support of the abhorrent and despicable treatment of minority groups by the dictatorial tyrannies which with this nation is now pledged to destroy. In dissent, Justice Robert Jackson presaged the staying power of a ruling premised on national security. A military order, however unconstitutional, is not apt to last longer than the military emergency. Even during that period, a succeeding commander may revoke it all. But once a judicial opinion rationalizes such an order to show that it conforms to the Constitution, or rather rationalizes the Constitution to show that the Constitution sanctions such an order, the court for all time has validated the principle of racial discrimination in criminal procedure and of transplanting American citizens. The principle then lies about like a loaded weapon, ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim of an urgent need. Now, Korematsu's conviction was subsequently vacated in 1983, and at that time, he told the judge, "I would like to see the government admit that they were wrong and do something about it so that this will never happen again to any American citizen of any race, creed, or color." That never occurred. And although Korematsu is reviled, it is still good law. It has never been overturned. 3 years ago, Justice Scalia, in a talk to law students at the University of Hawaii, said, "The Supreme Court's Korematsu decision upholding the internment of Japanese Americans was wrong, but it can happen again." To be sure, Korematsu is a case about the treatment of United States citizens. The revised travel ban executive order does not seek to infringe the right of citizens. Rather, it impacts those outside of this country with no right to resettle or travel in the United States. I get that. And I get that there is no Supreme Court ruling that broadly states that even for the purpose of national security, the government cannot take action against suspect classes simply because they are members of that class, whether it's based on religion or ethnicity. And finally, I get that some supporters of the travel ban, like Andrew McCarthy, writing in the National Review last month, would argue that the left and the courts are determined to prevent extreme vetting. And I also get that the Constitution is not a suicide pact, and that he goes on to say that alien Muslims somehow have a First Amendment Establishment Clause right against enhanced inspection, and that an immigration system that has always vetted against totalitarian political ideologies cannot vet against this one, Sharia supremacism, because it shrouds itself in religion. Mr. McCarthy suggests that the executive orders were intended to protect the United States from the threats posed by radical Islam. And to do so, we must establish a screening system that vets others for Islamic radicalism. McCarthy wonders, how do you ever get there if you disavow a purpose to subject alien Muslims to heightened scrutiny? But that very purpose betrays our values. That purpose speaks not to individualized security determinations. That purpose speaks not to what someone may have done, said, or thought. Rather, that purpose is animated primarily, if not solely, by where they are from, which then links closely to the religion that that person adheres to. That purpose seeks to preemptively hold all Muslims as guilty because they are Muslim, and it is eerily similar to holding all Japanese Americans guilty simply because their families originally came from Japan. We need to do better, and surely we can do better. Have we, the American public, shifted away from decrying the blunt policy tools of Korematsu to embracing a principle where hard security interests take precedence above individual liberties and basic human rights? Perhaps our values are now security first, principles of democracy and inclusion second. Although most would agree that U.S. interests are better served in the long run by the serve of democracy abroad, some argue that hard security interests must always take precedence, at least in the short term. History, again, should remind us of the pitfalls inherent in enacting policy from a place of fear of the other. I'll take you back to May 1882. President Chester Arthur signed into law the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the first major law restricting immigration to the United States. It was enacted in response to economic fears, especially on the West Coast, where native-born Americans attributed unemployment and declining wages to Chinese workers whom they also viewed as racially inferior. The Chinese Exclusion Act effectively halted Chinese immigration to the U.S. for 10 years and prohibited Chinese from becoming United States citizens. Through the Geary Act of 1992, the law was extended for another 10 years before becoming permanent in 1902. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the first federal law to exclude a specific ethnic group from immigrating to this country. Writing in Humanities magazine in 2015, Ross Yelsey, a writer at Columbia University's Weatherhead East Asian Institute, described the act, which was extended until 1943, as outlawing all Chinese laborers, allowing only diplomats, teachers, students, and merchants to enter the country. It also prevented permanent Chinese aliens from ever becoming citizens. As a result, the majority of Chinese Americans who eventually had to register with the government for special ID cards were always vulnerable to deportation. Chinese caught without documentation could be jailed, deported, or sent to a labor camp. Back to the fear that drove this act. That fear was born of the massive Chinese immigration that took place from the 1850s through the 1870s. During those decades, tens of thousands of Chinese journeyed across the Pacific, drawn to mining jobs sparked by the California Gold Rush and construction jobs provided by the Central Pacific Railroad. The work was dangerous and the pay was awful. But Chinese immigrants facing poverty, conflict, and famines in their own homeland found the opportunities in America worth the risk. A family in China, according to a 2015 New York Historical Society exhibit, could be kept out of poverty if a Chinese immigrant sent them back 1/4 of the most meager United States wage. Exploiting Chinese immigrants' willingness to work, Yelsey notes, American employers often hired Chinese workers instead of white workers, whose unions demanded far higher wages. American workers feared the Chinese would replace them as the major labor force and rise above Native Americans in wealth and status. In time, according to Yelsey, white workers, infuriated by the labor competition and emboldened by widely held anti-Chinese racial and eugenic sentiments, retaliated against the Chinese with violence and political activism. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the government's reaction to the American workers' fear. In a December 2015 Washington Post article, Yanan Wang writes that the aim of the working man's Party, a labor organization with a particular focus on Chinese immigrant labor on the Central Pacific Railroad, was straightforward and supported by many Californians at that time. The party channeled latent suspicions surrounding Chinese cheap labor into cartoonish depictions of a homogenous group of immigrants, supposedly all bent on wreaking havoc on American life. Aside from the caricature of the dirty, pilfering Chinaman, there were images depicting the Chinese as violent and destructive. One drawing offered an unironic representation of what would happen if you allowed a Chinese person into your home. They would start out as a cute, harmless kitten and then turn into monstrous tigers that murdered your entire family. Wang, quoting the historian Erica Lee, writes that all these depictions contributed to a rhetoric that tied national security with racial anxieties. The Chinese Exclusion Act was premised on the notion that the Chinese could not assimilate, that they were inherently un-American, and therefore unable to assimilate. We see strands of this in our current discussions about Muslims. And so when the act was finally repealed in 1943, it was not because of a surge of pro-Chinese sentiment in this country. It was because the Chinese became our allies in World War II, fighting against the Japanese. That repeal, by the way, came in the same year that we began to intern Japanese Americans. Since it was repealed in 1943, the Chinese Exclusion Act has been remembered as a dark period in American history, not unlike Karematsu. And though that ruling and the Chinese Exclusion Act targeted ethnicity and not religion, both were justified on grounds that they served to protect national security interests. America's dark history of succumbing to fear of the other has repeatedly led us to alienating and discriminating against others, be they ethnically, racially, or religiously different. We also not make the mistake of associating that dark history with one political party or another. It was less than 30 years ago when two different presidential administrations, that of George H.W. Bush and of Bill Clinton, succumbed to the fear of the other. The fear then, Haitians infected with the HIV virus. It was September 1991. Haiti's then president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, was overthrown, leading to a flood of refugees making their way north toward the United States. These refugees were interdicted by the United States Coast Guard in the high seas in the final months of President George H.W. Bush's presidency. These refugees did not include Islamist terrorists, nor were they cause for suspicion because of any perceived inclination that they might sympathize with our enemy. In interviews with the Coast Guard, the refugees expressed well-founded fears of political persecution were they to be returned to their homeland in Haiti, which should have led the government to transporting them to the mainland United States, where they could have sought political asylum. But these refugees tested positive for HIV, which at that time was a virus that engendered a high degree of fear and uncertainty. So the Bush administration denied them entry into the United States, instead opting to place them in a corner of Guantanamo Bay, where they would soon become the next administration's problem. Candidate Bill Clinton proclaimed, "If I were president, I would, in the absence of clear and compelling evidence that they weren't political refugees, give them temporary asylum until we restore the elected government of Haiti." But once in office, instead of admitting them to the United States, President Bill Clinton ordered the Haitian refugees be held at Guantanamo and then repatriated back to the United States when it was safe to do so. The refugee population at Guantanamo Bay grew to tens of thousands during the first half of the 90s. The refugees lived on Guantanamo in inhumane conditions, marked by poor sanitation, razor wire, guard towers. One of the counsel for the Haitians, Harold Coe, a former dean of Yale Law School and a noted human rights scholar, later wrote that by March 1993, the group had been there for nearly a year and a half, living in squalid conditions without toilets, beds, or any semblance of privacy. The group included several dozen children, including unaccompanied minors, who were wandering about the camp without supervision. It included babies who had lived their entire lives behind United States barbed wire, people with T-cell counts below 200 whose immune systems were effectively destroyed, and a man with both infectious tuberculosis and pneumonia who was too sick to be removed, but hence left in the company of hundreds of other immunosuppressed people. The group included pregnant women who were at risk of premature delivery because of their HIV status, and husbands deliberately separated from their wives who had been evacuated for emergency medical care. According to a 2005 Slate magazine article by Brant Goldstein, the author of a book about the plight of the Haitian refugees, the refugees responded with a hunger strike, and after raucous protests against their confinement, a number were thrown in the naval brig as if they were criminals. Worse still, federal authorities refused to release the sickest Haitians, even though military physicians on Guantanamo lacked the means to treat them. In June of '93, a federal judge in Brooklyn declared that the president's policy of detaining refugees at Guantanamo outrageous, callous, and reprehensible, and criticized him for treating the Haitians in a manner usually reserved for spies and murderers. The court ordered the immediate release of 158 detainees just months into President Clinton's first term. In its ruling, the court held that it was illegal to detain refugees indefinitely, and that both the Bush and Clinton administrations had unfairly applied its exclusion of HIV-positive immigrants to the Haitians at Guantanamo. The court further held that the refugees were to be released to anywhere but Haiti. The Clinton administration response closed the camp and allowed the Haitians into the United States. Here again, we vividly see what happens when the government is driven by the fear of the other, and ensuing ensuing policy determinations fail to correctly identify those in need of refuge from those seeking to calm horror and terror. The Haitians, the Chinese, the Japanese Americans all have one thing in common. Our government succumbed to the fear of the other and allowed that fear to drive our policy. The policy sought not to discern, simply to categorize. I know a little something about being categorized as other. I lived and worked in Jordan for three years ago, where I spent much of my time focusing on the impact of the Syrian refugee crisis on children, many of whom were living in refugee camps with their displaced families. So there I was, a black man working on child protection issues that disproportionately impacted refugee girls in a culture that, understandably, does not easily trust outsiders, particularly men, on matters involving the opposite gender. I also happen to be Haitian. Though I was born in America, I grew up in Haiti, and I hail from a family of Haitian immigrants. I left the United States at 6 months old, bound for Haiti, where my paternal grandmother would raise me. Some 6 years later, she would pass the baton to my uncle, then a medical student in Mexico City. He, like my grandmother, was doing his part to give my newly minted immigrant parents time to settle into their new country and learn their new language and acclimate to stable jobs they had yet to acquire and secure housing. When I came back to New York just past the age of 6, I remember vividly being made fun of in school because I knew very little English, and the English I did know was tinged with an accent from some other place. As a law student here at Michigan in the mid-1990s, I traveled to Miami on spring breaks to help asylum lawyers represent Haitians paroled into the United States from Guantanamo Bay. And now I have the privilege of working with a team of professionals who seek to protect and advance the rights of refugees and asylum seekers in the United States and beyond. My journey has at times been charmed and at others tortured, and I'm all too aware of what it means to be in the minority. The Haitian American boy in New York struggling to command English, the Haitian American law student helping represent Haitians who seemed not fully Haitian to those I was trying to help, the black American guy in Jordan conducting complicated conversations with scared girls and their mothers. I'm an American-born black man of Haitian descent who has been a naval officer, a law firm lawyer, a public policy and human rights advocate, and a teacher who now serves as a lawyer in an environment not frequented by people with my far from linear professional path. I'm not of Japanese ancestry. I'm not Chinese. nor am I an HIV-positive Haitian, and I'm not Syrian. But I have been the other. So I think I have some sense of what other means. I have some inkling of what it means to have one's narrative depersonalized into stories that we tell ourselves about us and them. I'm not so sure that a young boy who lived in Haiti and Mexico, who moved back to America with an accent only to later serve as a United States naval officer and then a human rights lawyer in the Middle East, is traditionally American. But then again, it is my otherness that makes me perfectly American. I'm a mixture of a whole lot of something else, and that enables me to reflect the us that is America. Perhaps that is why I'm still clinging to the belief that Emerald Lazarus' words on the base of the Statue of Liberty are more than words, that they say something about who we are, where we are from, and where we are headed. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Which brings me back to Syria. According to the Migration Policy Institute this past January, 18,007 Syrian refugees were resettled in the United States between October 1st of 2011 and December 31st of 2016. That's 18,007. Internationally, close to 4.9 million Syrians had been registered as refugees as of early January 2017. The vast majority are in first asylum countries such as Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. Only a fraction are likely ever to be permanently resettled. Facing dim resettlement prospects and eager to establish new lives, nearly 900,000 Syrians have headed to Europe and filed asylum claims there since the beginning of the war. Let's contrast the 18,000 Syrians resettled in the United States with our tradition. Between 1975 and 1995, the United States ultimately resettled 1.3 million Southeast Asians in countries around the world, including more than 800,000 in the United States on the heels of the Vietnam War. Starting about 20 years ago, the United States took in some 146,000 refugees from the Balkans after our military intervention in Bosnia and Kosovo. And after our intervention in Iraq last decade, we took in some 120,000 Iraqi refugees. This is what historical leadership on refugee issues looks like. In those instances, we pitched in with the international community to share the responsibilities of protection around the globe, as Professor Hathaway writes. Though we have a track record of making policy from the narrow, misguided viewpoint of the fear of the other, we also know something about aspired, give me your tired, your poor leadership. Such leadership attempts to discern the harmed from those seeking to do harm. It is an imperfect, impractical judgment, to say the very least, but I suspect this exercise is what justice and mercy demand. The alternative is a wholesale categorization of the other that treats the harmed and those seeking to do harm equally. The former, the tradition that Emerald Lazarus wrote of, lifts a lamp of leadership. The latter, that of internment, exclusion, and ban, speaks to our darker side. Wallowing in such darkness, the persuasive darkness of fear, we risk not seeing those beautiful babies that moved our president last week. And in that darkness, we risk not seeing the face of that small child lying face down on the beach. His name was Alyan. Remember. So shouldn't our refugee policies place him and other beautiful babies that mean us no harm? Shouldn't we place them first? Thank you.
We will take questions from the audience. Please raise your hand.
I stunned him into silence.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. I have two questions. The first is, from a legal point of view, I'm curious, so the fact that the Supreme Court decisions in those 3 cases challenging Japanese American internment between 42 and 44 were never overturned, even though they're universally recognized as, terrible failed judgments. It seems like, there have been invocations of this as a precedent by people in the Trump administration, which is very weird, not as a negative precedent, right? So I'm wondering, what happened? Can those cases be used as precedent? I'm asking this as a non-legal person, so that's my first question. And the second question, or maybe it's more of a comment, is in terms of your historical examples, thinking about the unwillingness to take refugees in the current moment, Syrians and others, I wonder if maybe another another appropriate historical example are the debates around the Displaced Persons Acts of 1948 and 1952. And there was widespread reluctance to take Jews, even as the horrors of what had happened in Europe were known. And, they were these compromise kind of agreements, which also allowed a lot of Baltic peoples in. And so, but, thinking about the wariness about Jews in 1948 and then 1952. So I just wonder, and also the inadequacy of the numbers that were allowed in those quotas. I wonder if that maybe is an example to think about for today as well. So thank you.
Thank you. With regard to your first question as to whether Karamate can be used as precedent, as I mentioned, that case hasn't been overturned. It's still used. I remember when I was in law school, it came up in the context of the strict scrutiny concept. So it is certainly referred to in that context over and over again. It hasn't been overturned. In order for it to be overturned, a case would have to come up challenging it squarely, and the court would have to issue a ruling overturning it. So the other 2 cases are referring to the Chinese Exclusion Act case?
No, there were 3 cases around Japanese internment that came to the Supreme Court.
Yes. Test my first-year law school memory. Is it Hobayashi? Professor Hathaway, is that the name? I'm not gonna. I think it was Hobayashi was one, or something along those lines. And I don't think that's been overturned either. But it was used for a different principle, and I'm not going to remember, so I'm not going to try to opine. My con law professor, Donald Regan, is probably tisking right now that I can't remember. But they are still precedent. But I think they have been sort of resigned to this sort of fate in the canon of, we all know it's not good law, and we won't go there. I think it was Professor Primus at the law school sort of has this theory about it's that those sorts of cases are consigned to sort of a dead letter fate. So I have not seen it cited for any sort of authority to be able to justify the travel ban. I don't think anybody would go there. Well, you know what?
Negative use of it, right? To say this is what can happen, but and not to interrupt, but like when that Robert Jackson quote, if I remember correctly, when he said it's like a loaded gun, he said we need to throw the loaded gun into the sea because otherwise there's always the chance that that loaded gun goes off.
Yes.
So that was an argument about like these need to be overturned or vacated or something.
That's exactly right. I mean, as a naval officer, I worked in national security. I defended a lot of sailors and Marines who were being prosecuted for espionage. So I was read into all of these programs, as you call it, and I fully start to appreciate the importance of national security principles and understood what my clients had done. So I certainly would never belittle national security concerns. They're often quite serious and weighty issues. But I often worry that we often too many times use national security as a sort of a fast track to making things happen on a policy level that we ought not. And then, as we've seen with the travel ban, the government's position has been that the judiciary ought to simply sort of pass on the validity of the travel ban and not look any further. And the courts have said, of course, you get some deference in the area of immigration, but we still, as a branch of the government, have an obvious and important obligation to inquire further. So my concern often is that national security sometimes is used to make things happen that ought not happen. And then as far as the 1948 and 1952 references you made, yes, you're right as well. I remember, was it the St. Louis, the ship that was turned back, right? So I think your argument is absolutely right, that there has been a number of instances in the past where we've made policy from that fear of the other. But I also think that there's some hope there, that when we look at Vietnam and we look at the crisis in the Balkans and Iraq, that we have been able to open the doors and open it widely enough. And so what I've been trying to think about is a place where we don't simply wholesale sweep people into a big box, but rather we think about careful, individualized determinations along the lines that Justice Murphy spoke of. Professor?
Hardy, I think if there was a silence, it was because we were all simply stunned by the incredible elegance of what you had to say, and were deeply touched by it. So thank you so much for writing something so gorgeous. The question I have, you spoke in terms of the American fear of the other, which I think is well established. And I guess the question is, do you view that as something uniquely American, or do you view us as simply one example of a broader global anxiety about the other? And maybe if you're willing to go beyond where you were in terms of situating the problem, to give us your thoughts on, if you have thoughts on how to get out of the mess. I guess my worry, to be frank, is that, outside of the 3 or 4 regional states that have had little choice but to accept Syrians simply by force of geography and borders, you really perhaps have Angela Merkel and Justin Trudeau that you can look to as examples of reaching out. Nobody else has. And indeed, most of Angela Merkel's colleagues have condemned her for having been gracious in the face of refugee flows, colleagues across Europe. So I guess the question is, President Obama came up with a one-off pledging conference that seemed to offer nothing. The UN Refugee Agency in the big conference last September came up with an agreement to have agreements to agree someday. Where's the leadership? And what would you see from your optic as the beginnings of a way out of the fear of the other and our blindness to refugees?
With respect to your first question, Professor Hathaway, the fear of the other, I think certainly is a global phenomenon. It's not unique to America. In fact, when I was in Jordan, I want to be really precise with my words here, I found myself in an instance where some of the people I was working with, Jordanian nationals, and I want to say this is very discreet, but they had some serious misgivings about the Syrians coming into the country, in large part because, as many of you know, Jordan is not a well-to-do country. And so there were many Jordanians who felt that the Syrians were imposing on the economy, on the infrastructure, and on schools. It got to the point that the Jordanian government implemented this 80-20 policy where if you were an NGO and you were going to enact some sort of program that delivered services to Syrians living in Jordan, 80% of the good of that program could go to the Syrians you're trying to serve, but you also had to reserve 20% to local Jordanians. And that caused an extensive amount of resentment among NGOs who felt like they were there to serve strictly and solely the Syrians. So at first blush, it seemed like that policy was problematic. It turned out in the long run it was actually helpful because it started to tamp down resentment among Jordanians because heretofore they had been saying all of these NGOs came into the country to do good, but they were only serving the Syrians when the Jordanians had been there, and many of them had been long-suffering or had been depending on the kindness of strangers. So I saw that there. And again, I want to be very careful not to say this is all, but yeah, I saw that worry about the other and people using language that was far for precise, and it reminded me of the history of this country. So it is certainly not something unique to us, and my suspicion it's probably these conversations occur in Europe and other places in much the same manner. As far as the way out, I don't have a really good answer here. I mean, I wish I did, and and my line of work this year has been a particularly hard one. And so it is hard to not default to pessimism. And I've tried not to go there in my talk because we have seen we've seen some things happen that we never thought we would see on our watch. And in fact, to the extent that we may have decried the policies of the last administration, some of us look back and go, maybe it wasn't so bad. But I don't know the answer. I was at Guantanamo Bay to observe the 9/11 hearings a couple of years ago. And while I was there, I got to go on a tour, which was like, like 3/4 of a mile. But I got to see the camp where the Haitians were held. And it was sobering because it's just outside and it was 95-degree weather. There's no shelter. The guard towers were there. And it sort of brought it home personally to me. And so I still believe that we can be that beacon, and that's what Human Rights First is about, is pushing the United States to be the example for the rest of the world. But I don't have I don't see a clean way out because a lot of us in the NGO community are wondering whether engaging this administration is a productive and worthwhile activity. And I believe that we have to find some way to engage. Otherwise, we're going to have a really long 4 years. But I don't have a way out.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. My apologies.
Oh, sorry.
It's related to what was said before, so I want to follow up on it. Making 2 points. One point is certainly racism and othering is definitely, of course, a part of human nature, one could argue, and it comes out and displays itself in different contexts in different countries. But the United States has the additional burden or advantage of also being a superpower, and because of that carries more weight than others. And for that reason, at least, I think it has additional responsibility that privilege brings with it, the international privilege it brings with it. So that would be, I wonder what you think about that. The second thing I wanted to point out is that, as a Muslim, this sort of brings very close to my heart too, being othered, finally. Who would have thought, but here we are. But what is fascinating is that there is a global context that is different. That is the context of terrorism. Unlike conventional warfare, where you are able to define actually your enemy, which is of course what the Trump administration is doing by assigning nation states and countries as the enemy. Terrorism is much more complicated because anyone could be technically a terrorist. As a consequence, that is probably why you and others have not come up with a solution, because technically both the violence and sort of dealing with it is spread out within populations and across populations at the same time. And the fact that all these terrorists somehow have a Muslim connection, I think, is what makes religion and Islam very different as a potential threat than it would have made others that you very eloquently talked about before this, the Chinese, the nations, and others, because it is not that clearly defined. They are not coming from one place. They're coming from all over, and that, I think, enhances the fear.
You're absolutely right. And on your point about sort of the U.S. being a superpower, I'll invoke also soft power. What I saw when I've lived overseas, and I've traveled and done things like needs assessments. You may often hear someone speak critically of the United States, but then they'll talk about how they can't wait to turn on their iPod and listen to American music, watch an American television show, and eat a hamburger, right? So the power of soft power is very much, it's real, and whether one is critical or embracing of the United States government, there's an influence there, and it came up constantly in my work in Jordan. I mean, I saw it all of the time, and people used to try to ask me to sort of be held to account for the government. I was like, well, that's a little hard, but they understood that the United States sort of, when it steps forward, others are likely to follow for better or for worse. And so that is something that at my organization, that's the main theme of our work, is to say what you do, the United States government, is very much unlike what others do. You really can set the tone in a way that can speak to our values or betray them. And so whether it's indefinitely holding detainees at Guantanamo Bay or some of the examples I talked about today, we try to bring that forward in clear relief and then put forward policy solutions. And I take your point about terrorism as well, that I worry as a black man, that's all I've ever known, that I remember instances growing up in Queens, New York City, where there'd be a raft of crime and it'd be committed by, two black men in the community. And now there was this sort of, in my high school, there were comments about, be careful, black boys, because people are looking for you. And I was like, I didn't do anything. And so I tend to be sensitive to those claims and try to sort of highlight that in the work that we do. But you're right, with terrorism, where it suffuses and it's hard to delineate, I think it's just easier from a policy perspective to simply say, all those from country and do it that way, which leads to, I'm not saying anyone here didn't figure out or the administration didn't figure out, but it leads to policy outcomes that are incredibly problematic. But it's far simpler to do that because, as Professor Hathaway asked, we're dealing with a question that has kept many up for many nights and will continue, and yet we have to do something. And so we come up with some sloppy policy solutions.
Hi, thank you so thank you so much. I have two questions as well. So the first one is regarding to the advocacy work. So at the very beginning, when it comes to the refugee crisis, and the U.S. government, a lot of governments across the world are saying that we should bring all those refugees, and people are worried about the fact that those refugees coming in, they might bring a lot of economic and social burden. And one of the ways to offset is that, for example, Human Rights New York or some other media and stuff, they try to portray people, the refugees, as neurologists, the scientists, and all sorts of things, so that they come in the U.S., they don't bring all these economic burdens. But that, I think, will backfire as well. The refugees do not have to be the good people to be resettled. And so I'm just wondering how to, Human Rights First or other organizations, how to strike this balance to make sure that people can accept refugees without worrying the national security, of course, and also the economic burdens and all that. And my second question is that I myself have very deep connection with Syria, and I'm very happy that this world is paying attention to the Syrian crisis. But how do we make sure this is not a mere performance? Because this might well come into real politics. For example, there are a lot of Yemenis, Somalis, Afghans who a lot of refugees are being repatriated back to Afghanistan or Somalia. But those places not as exciting as Syria, and people start to ignore that. So I'm just wondering how you perceive that part and how to make sure that refugees do not discriminate against on that aspect based on nationality.
Okay. On the first question, in terms of this economic social burden and how far we can get with that argument, I recall being at there was a State Department conference. It was a PR conference held last September. That is, it focused on sort of the marketing of the stories of refugees. And we had one of our clients from Human Rights First, a young Syrian woman who was flourishing. She spoke, and then someone got up and said, your narrative, your story is a powerful one. And she got back up and said, could you stop referring to it as a story? And she said, it's my life. And so ever since then, I have to pause when I think about sort of putting forward the good refugee story, because I wonder that has implications, right? That what am I suggesting? You either have you have to come to America and get a PhD, and then I have to be able to put you on MSNBC and then say, see, they do no harm. And so we certainly worry about that. One of the things that we've done at Human Rights First is we focus on I think what's an unusual bent is that we focus on the power of veterans to help put forward the argument about national security. That is, we have a coalition, a grassroots coalition of hundreds of veterans across the country, which we access regularly. And there, we're hoping that these women and men who have fought in Afghanistan and Iraq can step forward and say, here's what safety looks like, what safety and security looks like, and here's what it does not look like, in hopes that it's not about their politics, but rather they've been out there, they know what it means to be able to get an Afghan interpreter at their side, they know what it means to make allies in the field. So we've been trying to use that as sort of a unique approach to be able to get people to listen to our work, as opposed to just focusing solely on the good refugees. We do that, right? Because I think some of that has to be done, but we are mindful that there's some problematic aspects to that. On your second point, I want to make sure I understand. You talked about the mere performance. Can you?
No, I'm just saying that, for example, say Germany is taking up all those refugees, and it comes from my personal experience as well, because I have a couple of clients who are trying to get resettled in the U.S., and we're trying to get him resettled in Canada, but Canada has very few slots reserved for non-Syrians. So I'm just saying that probably like Canada, like being one of the countries saying that we are accepting a lot of refugees, but only because of the Syrian refugee crisis, not because we actually care about refugees.
I see. So this sounds like your concern is, how about all the other refugees that are not necessarily in the spotlight on a day-to-day basis? You're absolutely, that's a valid concern. I mean, our retrenchment certainly impacts Syrians and the refugees from those other 5 countries, but it certainly goes broader. I think it pervades our policy apparatus, those who make decisions. So it's a real concern. I think we often lead, I'm trying to think about the strategic from our perspective at Human Rights First. We lead with Syrians in large part because it's the salient news of the day. There's a powerful, here, I mean, I'm going to do it, story there. But we try not to do it to the exclusion, but frankly, it's hard nowadays to get bandwidth on fill-in refugee from such a blank country not named in one of the 6 or the 7 countries. I mean, it's hard to get traction. And sometimes we have to be pragmatic, right? So I think we push on that because it's a lever that we can get, we can possibly make some progress on, and then hopefully that has long enough tailcoats that we bring others. But it's one of pragmatism, frankly, that we're doing it, but we're intentional and we're aware that we're doing that, hoping that rising tide ends up lifting many or all boats.
So, I don't think all right. So, I was in the government as a United States Foreign Service officer. As I recall, I think it's important to look at definitions and understand why certain things happen. For example, as I recall with the Haitian refugees, basically what the United States, the way the United States termed them at the time was as economic refugees, discriminating against economic refugees, or at least making a difference between economic refugees and political refugees, which has a definite definition within the refugee treaties and the conventions. Someone who has a well-founded fear of returning to the country for reasons of religion, political, ethnic origin, or political belief. So, so I'm interested in how the organization looks at people who are caught up in a huge problem of drought, starvation, etc. And then do you put them in the same category as those Syrian refugees who are quite clearly under the definitions of political refugees? How do you distinguish between the two, or do you?
We do, and we don't go that far. In fact, I think there's a healthy debate, probably Professor Hathaway can speak about this better than I can, about sort of environmental refugees, for example, people fleeing global warming. And I think there's a consensus that if the more we open up that door, there's a likelihood, or greater likelihood, that we're eroding the quintessential definition of refugee as articulated in the 1951 Convention and subsequent documents. So that organizations such as ours, we tend to hew narrowly to the traditional definition. So we represent people we believe have a well-founded fear of persecution based on the 5 grounds, and so we stick to that. And so at Human Rights First, we're constantly turning away, and I would say turning away back into the sort of the outdoors, but rather giving people referral to organizations that might be of help. But we stick to political refugees. We're sticking to the context of asylum. And so we recognize that those who come to our shores and say, there was some economic plight in my country X, and that's why I'm here. And the best we can do in those circumstances is say, you might want to call this organization for help, whether it's legal or psychosocial needs or what have you. But we focus very, very, very pragmatically on the narrow convention definition, because I think we do worry about the erosion of that definition. Professor Hathaway, is that a fair?
As I listen to you, I always tell my students the surest way to fail my class is to ever use the term economic refugee. It doesn't exist, right? You're either a refugee or you're an economic migrant. And if you're a refugee, that could be because you're being persecuted by economic means, as our courts have said. Right? Our courts have also said if you're being persecuted and you also seek a better life, that takes nothing away from your refugee life. So I think we have to be careful about this. This is the same language that's now being used by the Chinese to say that no North Korean is a refugee. They're all economic migrant or economic refugees, or choose your favorite flavor of the month. So what you're saying, I think, is right. Stick with the definition, but recognize that our courts around the world have interpreted it in ways that go way beyond what people imagined in 1951. And that's a good thing. It's kept it alive in a world that doesn't look like 1951.
Can I just add something to that comment? I mean, the interesting thing too is when you look at other states, like if you look at France and the treatment of the sans-papiers, those without papers. I mean, Miriam Pickton's work shows when you think about the Haitian case, when there's this illness clause that allows people who are ill, to remain or to give them asylum, and what she found is that people then, will purposely make themselves ill with the most extreme, and it was an anecdotal case that she was never able to prove, but of somebody infecting themselves with HIV, right? Because by that, they were allowed to stay in France, right? So it's when you come down to the illness question, like, okay, I mean, it's a very complicated thing because it can produce these terrible unintended effects, right?
Absolutely right.
Thank you for your remarks. Can you offer some advice to everyday citizens in the country who are interested in trying to impact change, either in terms of U.S. policy, which you were particularly optimistic about, but also in terms of addressing this increasing anti-refugee, anti-immigrant kind of rhetoric and context? So what do ordinary people, whether students or citizens, do to combat this changing environment?
I think it has to do with attacking that other again. And so Canada has a right. I mean, so Canada, there's private hosting of families. I will say personally, I believe they have a right. That when you are standing at the bus stop with the other, and you come to realize, no, that's a mother who has a child, just like you have a child in the same school. I think you could start to work through that wall and that us-them. So in our work, we often talk about just getting different individuals to the same table. So for example, we started to have an interfaith breakfast at Human Rights First. And so every other month, we bring together people of various faith backgrounds who may not normally have occasion to work or talk with one another, in hopes of just saying, our common framework here is, we're in America and we want to help those who are less fortunate. So you, the mosque, you, the temple, you, the church, let's have a common discussion. And now we've started to talk about how do we expand that kind of enterprise so that's not just faith-based, but that it is sort of this opportunity to have a discussion with people who you don't normally have a conversation with. So I would encourage that if there are ways, I think is it the Madisonian dinner or the Jeffersonian dinners. So that's this idea of that President Jefferson once had, was that again bringing people together around a shared meal, people who you wouldn't necessarily talk to, and started to work through that echo chamber. And so we've tried to sort of promote that sort of just breaking bread and getting to know one another. It's simplistic, but I think there's some value to it, because otherwise it's really easy to say, whether you're progressive or you fancy yourself some other, it's easy to say them, for all those who might have been shocked on election day, maybe it's because that echo chamber I constructed. I live in DC where, you read the Post and everybody votes Democrat, and we're all outraged about the same things, and we have the same Twitter feed and the same Facebook, and at the end of the day, we don't end up meeting or really spending time talking to people who might view the world differently. And there's value to that in my estimation. And so I think thinking through on a very basic level about how to open up our small real worlds or social media worlds to ideas and views that are not in line or not constant with ours is a really good way to start. So for students, I've talked to some of my students about having conversations with your roommates that you normally wouldn't have. I remember after the Charleston, South Carolina incident, I think it was PBS hosted this town hall, and I thought they did a great job of having people in the audience who normally live in the same city, again, weren't used to talking to one another. I think having an opportunity to start having real, uncomfortable conversations is a good place. And if you're not uncomfortable having these conversations, then it's not a real conversation, in my belief. Because when you talk about race, religion, ethnicity, they've got it. I mean, it's personal, right? I mean, they're going to be uncomfortable. And if it's not, then I think there's a way to modify it so that it's more powerful, more engaging.
I'd like to echo also, thanks for a wonderful presentation. Unfortunately, on this rather toxic strain in American history that we all wish weren't there, but have to combat to this day. I also want to thank you for what you've done, for your service. I think all of us who've taught students who are interested in international affairs can benefit by looking at somebody like you and seeing that there are ways to really make a difference, apart from working for, say, the European Union and sitting around Brussels and cafes and enjoying yourself. My question is, you cited a lot of the important role of U.S. law and Constitution in this whole process. What about international law? Is there a role for reference to international laws and the role of international organizations in trying to, let's say, combat this othering that leads to these terrible political consequences?
Yes, I pause there because I think of Brexit and Marie Le Pen and so forth. So that harkens back to Professor Hathaway's earlier question that it's not unique to us, that there's these sort of insular nativism strands of thought that are really starting to be pervasive throughout the globe, I think. As far as the law is concerned, American courts tend to be not as receptive to international law, and so one of the efforts we try to at Human Rights First is to identify instances where we can import international law into the American framework. But for a whole host of reasons, American federal courts don't tend to readily embrace international law. But I think there are some principles and there's occasion to do that. But I leave it to some other people, since this is not my area of specialty, to sort of figure out how to make that happen. But I think there's occasion to embrace that. But having worked for a federal judge, I can tell you that there are a couple instances that international law came about, and he says, I'm going to stick to my canon, is what he still told me once when I tried to bring up some case. I think it was from somewhere in Africa, and he was like, why don't we look at the Federal Reporter hard, is what he said to me. So, and I think that's the bias that we have, is we don't need to go to some international canon to influence what our thought is. I think, having seen some Supreme Court cases in recent years that are making some strides in that direction, there's progress, but it's going to be incremental. But it's part of the way we as lawyers are trained in the United States of America. I think we tend to default to American law. In fact, if you didn't take an international law class, you could probably get away with going through Michigan Law School without spending much time on international principles. Is that a fair statement?
Not anymore.
Not anymore? Okay, thank you. All right, great. I'm wrong. I'm glad to be wrong.
We actually did become the first law school in the country to require an international law course.
Okay.
But still, that's off course.
And I'm assuming that's the exception
Right.
as opposed to the rule. They took it. Okay. All right. So I'm glad that we're doing that at Michigan. Go Blue. But it's the exception.
You can probably do something at Vieux.
So, yeah, that's right.
All right, we have to close, and please join me in thanking Hardy Vieux for